So now we have our second keynote of the day. So we have Professor Joel Melendez Vadillo, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His work focuses on the global circulation for radical ideas from the standpoint of working class intellectual communities. Dr. Melendez Vadillo's most recent book is The Lettered Barriada, Workers, Archival Power, and the Politics of Knowledge in Puerto Rico, published in 2021 by Duke University Press. And I don't know if there's an update here, but based on the Madison website, it says that you're finishing a book project, a book titled Puerto Rico and National History, and that is under contract with Princeton University Press. All right, so the book offers a national history of Puerto Rico, a country without a nation state. And the title of his talk is Luisa Capetillo as a Weaver of Dreams and Transnational Networks. Take it away.
Absolutely, thank you so much for that. Can everyone see the screen? See, perfecto, super. So I want to begin by acknowledging that the Wisconsin Union occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejo since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede their territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. I acknowledge the circumstances that led to the forced removal of the Ho-Chunk people and honor their legacy of resistance. This history of colonization informs my work and vision for a collaborative future. I recognize and respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation and the other 11 First Nations within the boundaries of Wisconsin. Now, I want to start also by expressing my absolute gratitude to Dr. Nancy Bird Soto and Dr. Amy Olin for the invitation to be here, to everyone involved in making this event. Thank you. I see many friends, comrades, and students in the audience, so I am truly privileged to be in community with all of you today, and it has been an amazing symposium. I'm just very excited to be here. And so I want to use my time today to ponder on a seemingly simple question that I think it has already been answered throughout the day. What else can we say about Luisa Capetillo that has not been said before? Since the path-breaking research of Norma Valle Ferrer and Julio Ramos in the 1980s, there have been multiple articles, books, presentations, and even a docudrama about the life of Capetillo. While most are in Spanish, these investigations have explored multiple facets of her life, her activism, and her ideas. But Capetillano studies, a term coined by our very own Nancy Bird Soto, have seen a renaissance in the past decade or so. Thus, I think there is much to say about Capetillo that has not been said before, even if archives are limited. The reason, as I hope to expand upon today, is because Capetillo's work transcended her temporality. So the title of my presentation, as Nancy mentioned, is Luisa Capetillo as a Weaver of Dreams and Transnational Networks. The text I'll be reading builds on an article that is forthcoming in Small Axe Journal that Nancy mentioned earlier today. And the issue will have a roundtable on Capetillo, so please be on the lookout for the issue, which should drop anytime next month. I will divide my presentation in 3 parts. First, I will talk about Capetillo as a weaver of networks. Second, I will provide an atemporal interlude. And third, I will briefly explore the idea of Capetillo as a time traveler. To honor your time, I will jump right into my presentation. So it was Monday, April 10, 1922. The headquarters of the Federación Libre de Trabajadores were located in San Juan Allen Street, and they received a long-distance phone call. The news that arrived from the town of Rio Piedras were somber. Luisa Capetillo, the anarcho-feminist that had dedicated her life to the organization of the laboring masses, was dead. Her lungs had succumbed to tuberculosis, a disease that seemed to haunt cigar workshops, just like the ones she had spent countless hours as a lectora, reading out loud to workers. As news of her death began to spread, delegations of workers from different parts of the city began making their way to her humble house in Rio Piedras. They wanted to say one last goodbye to someone that lived experiences some of them could only dream of. She opened a vegetarian restaurant and hostel in New York City. She had traveled extensively, and she published works that circulated in faraway countries. In life, Capetillo organized and built communities in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, and in the United States. She was also a fiery writer. She published 4 books and a newspaper, La Mujer, that circulated in the Caribbean, Latin America, the United States, and Europe. Her publications also circulated after her passing in 1922. For example, here we have 2 examples of the Argentinian anarchist newspaper, Nuestra Tribuna, that published 2 pieces of Capetillo 2 years after her death. One was La Mujer and the other La Mujer Esclava. As a woman working class intellectual, Capetillo went against the accepted patriarchal norms of her time imposed by Puerto Rico's cultural elite. But these patriarchal codes that operated in the world of letters were not only policed and enforced by the literary elite. Those that participated in Puerto Rico's working class intellectual community, which I have called in another place the letter barriada, also distrusted Capetillo. In the obituary published by the Federación Libre's newspaper, Justicia, its editors compared Capetillo to Louise Michel or Rosa Luxemburg. Both women had become pillars of the global radical tradition. Luisa Michel was an anarchist that fought in the Paris Commune, and Luxemburg was a German socialist that was assassinated because of her ideas. Like these 2 women, Capetillo was, as the editors noted, a trailblazer in the defense of women's rights in Puerto Rico. But Justicia's editors also took the opportunity to demonstrate their contempt. In life, Capetillo self-identified as an anarchist and built an impressive mental library to articulate and defend her ideas. In the obituary, however, the editors of Justicia questioned her understandings of those ideas that animated her activism and intellectual work. And I quote, "She was not a militant in the true concept of labor and social ideas," the editors noted. And they continued, "Her temperament and rebelliousness towards any discipline guided her to a certain ideology that nurtured her character, highlighting her semi-errant personality through the field of transformative ideas that was disconnected from those expressed by Karl Marx or Miguel Bakunin." And so they also infantilized her vegetarianism and politics rooted in love by saying that she looked at life like a little child. And so this contempt was nothing new. And I got nervous reading that quote because I translated it myself. And so we've been talking about translations. And then all of a sudden I was like, damn, they're gonna be actually analyzing how I translated this. So I apologize for that. Kudos to all the translators in the room. But this contempt that they expressed in that obituary was nothing new. She lived through them in life as well. This time, however, Capetillo could not defend herself as she often did. Capetillo's lived experiences, as I mentioned, were larger than life and could not be equated to the rest of the laboring masses. In the same page of her obituary, for example, an additional note announced the death of another working woman that excelled as a labor leader, Juana Pagan Rivera. In a highly illiterate world of labor, There were many working women like Pagan Rivera and not so many like Capetillo. Knowledge production became a marker of power, and that was something not lost on working class intellectuals. They wielded that power to articulate proximity to the laboring masses in their writings, but they also use other discursive tropes to also distance themselves from the quote unquote ignorant masses at times. In the early 20th century, Capetillo became a connector inside the multiple transnational networks that anarchists created across the Americas and around the world. Capetillo also became what historian Constant Batman has identified as a militant go-between. That is, Capetillo was one of the region's key actors in bringing together several networks and thus acting as go-betweens, pivotal to an effective transnationalism. It is from this resistance culture and the global networks that animated it that anarchists, socialists, and other radicals created what I have called the counter-republic of letters. It was and still operates as a transnational intellectual community and means of communications between those that have been casted outside of Western modernity. That is, most of the world's population. Luisa Capetillo was one of the many individuals that actively participated in the counter-republic of letters creation and expansion. And in the article where this presentation stems from, I dedicate a section to unpacking what I mean by this counter-republic of letters. So in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, the counter-republic of letters depended on the circulation of print materials. Newspapers were crucial in this endeavor, and anarchists like Capetillo excelled in their publication, with dozens of titles circulating in each country. And for example, we have here La Mujer, and unfortunately, we don't have any physical copies that survived or were archived of the newspaper La Mujer, but we do know that Capetillo's newspaper circulated in Argentina, Spain, Switzerland, Brazil, California, Chile, and France. And we know this from this small note that I found in the newspaper Tierra, the Cuban newspaper, in which she's asking newspapers from these countries to return the canje, the exchange that they had done with her in San Juan. So while most newspapers had short runs and were hunted by ephemerality, they served a key role in building transregional communication. Some had impressive runs and served as a crucial role as regional bulletin boards. Such was the case of Cuba's Tierra. With its 13-year run, anarchists from throughout the broader Caribbean, a social space that also includes New York City, Tampa, and the continental Caribbean, used the newspaper to build and sustain a transregional network. Luisa Capetillo used the pages of Cuba's Tierra on several occasions, and you have two examples there on the screen. So she used the newspaper's pages to alert those in the Caribbean's counter-republic of letters about repressive events taking place in Puerto Rico and called for international solidarity. Indeed, oftentimes when Capetillo wrote, her audience was not limited to the Caribbean, but she also imagined a broader international audience. And as a note, I just wanted to mention that if anyone is interested in these articles that she published in the Cuban anarchist press, I reproduced them in an anthology called Páginas Libres, published by Editora Educación Emergente, and it's also free access, so I'll put the link in the chat once I'm done with the presentation. So it seemed as if Capetillo could not stand still. After her first incursions into the world of labor, as sugarcane fields were blazing in 1905 during a series of strikes in her hometown of Arecibo, Capetillo never stopped working. Not only had she published extensively and was featured in the bourgeois press after being arrested for wearing pantsuits, but she also connected individuals through her oratory and organizing. In 1909, for example, Capetillo recorded her impressions of a trip she made around Puerto Rico when the Federación Libre, the Free Federation of Workers, sent their best speakers to spread their ideas in the countryside. Like an evangelist spreading the gospel of revolution, Capetillo met with peasants, workers, and intellectuals as she traveled from one public plaza to the other. As literary scholar Julio Ramos notes, this cruzada was important because it served to bridge the gap between the urban spaces imagined as civilized and the countryside imagined as barbarous. For Capetillo, however, the cruzada might have served other purposes. She was able to polish her oratory, something that she will later excel in, not only in Puerto Rico, but also in different parts of the counter Republic of Letters. These spaces were male dominated. Nonetheless, Capetillo navigated them and made her voice felt. She became an active member of the Federación Libre, for example, and organized unions, actively propagated their ideas, and participated in multiple labor congresses. Capetillo's literary work, I argue, has alchemic features. Scholars keep rethinking and reimagining her life and work. The archive that we have, however, is limited. Most of what we know about her life comes from feminist scholar Norma Valles Ferrer's path-breaking biographical work on Capetillo. But there are things that we might never be able to find in historical sources because they were not deemed important enough to be archived. To access unknown details of Capetillo's life, we might have to employ what literary scholar and historian Sylvia Hartman calls critical fabulation. That is, to conduct rigorous research and use the available sources to push the limits of our historical imagination and envision what could have happened. Not what happened, but what could have happened. In her book, Wayward Lives, for example, Hartman reconstructs the lives of young Black women in early 20th century New York City. Living in small apartment rooms and hostels, Hartman imagines how these young women might have read anarchist texts that had nothing to offer them. Indeed, Hartman notes, and I quote, "They had never listened to Lucy Parsons, they had never read Ida B. Wells, or envisioned the riot as a rally cry and refusal of fungible life. Only a misreading," and this is the key for me, "only a misreading of the key text of anarchism could ever imagine a place for wayward girls of color," end quote. In 1920, we know that Capetillo opened a vegetarian restaurant and a hostel in New York City. Using critical fabulation, we could imagine how maybe, and just maybe, the texts that these young Black women were misreading were provided by their Puerto Rican landlord, an anarchist committed to global revolution. But unlike those mostly male authors that they were reading, it was a revolution rooted in a complex understanding of human love. And it is because of that commitment to love to offer shelter to young Black women escaping the South racism, that the landlord could have been mocked by her comrades in her obituary. And with this, I am not saying that this is what happened. Absolutely not. I'm not this is not factual. But that critical fabulation could allow us to think about what could have happened, and in turn, help us expand the limits of our historical imagination and transcend the limits of the archive. Given the alchemic nature of her writings and the limits of the historical archive, critical fabulation might offer new ways to think about Capetillo's militancy within the counter Republic of Letters that she helped build. That intellectual community, as I have mentioned, and I will mention again because I think it's important, not only transcended physical spaces in New York, Tampa, Puerto Rico, Cuba, la República Dominicana, Mexico, but it also surpassed temporality. It continues to operate in present day, making Capetillo a time traveler. Part 2, Capetillo, the time traveler, a temporal interlude. It is a humid day, 2019. As always, it rains. Yankee occupation or not, it is the Caribbean. It rains, and it continues to rain. Perhaps it is a curse, maybe it's the Federicos, but it always rains in Claridad. The newspaper Claridad was launched in 1959, and as of 2022, it is Puerto Rico's longest running newspaper in circulation. It began as the official publication of the Movimiento Pro Independencia and later the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. The newspaper continues to advocate for the independence of Puerto Rico, and to offset its costs, its editors also organize a major cultural festival every year. While it is a space to prefiguratively enact and imagine a free Puerto Rico, the festival is attended by people from different positions within the political spectrum. The festival is usually celebrated in the spring, and there's a running joke that it always rains in Claridad. So it continues raining. There in the tents, where artisans sell their products, Capetillo is present. It was as if she was also seeking shelter from the pouring rain. I found Capetillo standing with her pantsuits, the same ones that got her arrested in Havana and mocked by her comrades in San Juan. She was there in the form of a handmade plushie. I bought a representation of Capetillo using the same money she had used to light a bonfire in one of her utopic stories. As I kept walking, I saw Capetillo once again. This time she was printed in the cover of a notebook. I walked a few more steps and there she was once again escaping the rain, but this time in the form of a shirt design. Capetillo is still alive, and on that night, she was hunting the stadium parking where the Claridad Festival was taking place. And that's a picture of my altar of Capetillo here at home. Part 3, and I'm concluding this. I promise that it'll make some sort of sense in a second. Capetillo's transhistorical power. So it has been said that the history of anarchism is a history of losers. It's a history of those that aspired to change every fiber of society, but never succeeded in their social revolution. It is true that anarchists were tortured, jailed, and executed by both capitalists and communists alike, and that they never won a revolution in a traditional sense. But the history of anarchism, a history in which Capetillo played an important role, forces us to question our understandings of failure and success. Some of their transgressive demands and aspirations from early 20th century are now part of our social fabric. Further, anarchists like Capetillo excelled in the world of culture and letters. Like Capetillo, anarchists across the Americas and around the world published numerous newspapers, wrote theatrical plays, and experimented with literature and poetry. The rhizomatic nature of anarchism allowed them to create a cultural fabric that animated and gave life to that which I have called the counter-republic of letters. As an active member in anarchist cultural worlds, Luisa Capetillo also used her pen to experiment with letters. And we've talked already about influencia de las ideas modernas, but I just wanted to mention something quickly. So in 1916, Capetillo published Influencias de las Ideas Modernas, which was, according to the translator and literary critic Lara Walker, a genre-defying text. And Walker continues, and I quote, "It includes long and short plays, fiction, essays, propaganda, letters, poems, philosophical reflections, and journal entries," end quote. And so I mentioned this because some of the theatrical plays that were included are still being staged in Puerto Rico more than a century after its publication. Yes, we can argue that Capetillo connected people across national borders through her activism and her writing, but what I'm trying to argue here is that her connections cannot be solely limited to space. She also transhistorically connected and still connects people across time. As those that wrote her obituary noted, and I quote, "Others will continue her work," end quote. 100 years after her death, and today celebrating her birthday, scholars, activists, and general audiences are still drawn to her work and are in active dialogue with her ideas. In the process, and this is something that we were talking about earlier with Amy's question, they are resignifying the memory of Capetillo. In 2013, for example, in Nuevo Dia, Puerto Rico's largest newspaper in circulation, announced that Capetillo's play, Influencia de las Ideas Modernas, would be staged in San Juan's Celébrate Theater. Other experimental pieces about Capetillo and inspired by her work have also been presented in different stages across the archipelago. In 1994, as I mentioned earlier, filmmaker Sonia Fritz also produced a docudrama inspired by her reading of Norma Valles Ferrer's biography of Capetillo. Further, that pantsuit image of Luisa Capetillo has acquired a life of its own, and it's been reproduced countless times by numerous artists. To commemorate the 100th anniversary of Capetillo's death, Puerto Rico's editora Educación Emergente put together and published a new edition of Julio Ramos' highly influential book, Amor y Anarquía. And let me just put a plug here, and I'm super happy that y'all are publishing with Editora Educación Emergente. It just makes my heart burst with happiness because Editora Educación Emergente is a scholarly press that is at the forefront of radical publishing and thinking in Puerto Rico. Their work is anchored in another understanding of thinking and theorizing Puerto Rico from and for the archipelago. And so Amor y Anarquía's recent edition includes the original text and new theoretical, interpretative, and scholarly intervention by people who are engaging with Capetillo's ideas in the current moment, including Dr. Nancy Bersoto and myself and other colleagues and friends. So the interest on Capetillo's life and work is not limited to scholars in Puerto Rico. In 2020, Teen Vogue, out of all places, Teen Vogue published an article about Luisa Capetillo. And I don't know what's happening in Teen Vogue. They've had some amazing articles on communism, on anarchism, and they published this piece on Luisa Capetillo. Similarly, educational projects like Rejected Princesses are incorporating Capetillo into their repertoire of stories to empower younger readers. Further, in 2021, Penguin Classics published A Nation of Women, the English translation of Mi Opinión, as part of their collection. So the Penguin Classics collections is often understood as the representation of the Western literary canon. They have published many of the authors that were part of Capetillo's impressive mental library, and I'm talking about Solá, Hugo, Dostoevsky, etc., etc. Capetillo's Mi Opinión is not a traditional text, but I argue it's an archive of the ideas that she was engaging with when it was published. While she might have entered the quote unquote World Republic of Letters by being published by Penguin, her texts continue to be a transgression. Perhaps her inclusion, it's merely an infiltration to destroy the canon from within. At least that's what I like to imagine. Luisa Capetillo's work continues to have an impact in the Caribbean's radical imaginaries. And this symposium, celebrating the work, life, and the birth of Luisa Capetillo, is a testament to it. As I have noted, Capetillo inhabited and helped build multiple cartographies of knowledge that crossed and connected communities in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, La Dominicana, in Tampa, Nueva York, etc., etc., etc. In the process, she also articulated multiple identities as a writer, as an organizer, and as a time traveler. As a women working class intellectual that was thinking and organizing towards another reality rooted in love and abolition, her memory is ever present and urgent. Today, her memory is a tool that can help us imagine and construct another world, just like she tried to do at the turn of the 20th century. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Jorel, for that fabulous, amazing presentation, because it makes us think of how we got into Capetillo, how amazing, how amazing she is, and also how relevant, right, that we keep bringing her into the present, because again, this is in this unruliness, right? The fact that we cannot pin her down, we cannot constrain her, we can also just, it's important to contextualize her, right, when approaching her work, but she's still here because that's the legacy of her thought. So, of course, if anybody has any questions, you can drop them in the chat as you're thinking of your questions. Just some remarks here of, some points that I found really important to highlight. This aspect of the transnational networks, because that also creates or is in tune with that sense of that the Spanish-speaking Caribbean diasporas, right, already since the 19th century, and those connections with people who were like-minded, in places like Ybor City, Tampa, New York City. And the fact that, with the transnational networks, there's also the questioning and the re-envisioning of the concept of the nation, right? And in the case, when Puerto Rico has never had the chance to be its own, separate nation state, although there is a Puerto Rican nationality, the fact that, she's, when you were showing the clips from the newspapers, I thought it was really interesting because we can think of, oh yes, the role of the newspapers in the 19th century in that sense of, what Benedict Anderson talks about, the imagined community and the nation, that the newspapers help create that sense of that imagined community, that you're sharing the same values or you're reading the same newspapers, with people that you're never going to meet in real life, right? And may not be exactly living right next to you, but you're creating that sense of nationhood, again, in the circulation of the newspapers and the same ideas. People are reading the same news. And the fact that here we have newspapers internationally, and that it's also a way of creating, of imagining, like envisioning this other community that transcends geographical, political borders. And yet at the same time, like Capetillo, she's very Puerto Rican, she's very Caribbean, she's also global. Like one thing does not cancel the other. So it's like thinking of the concept of the nation, which is in many ways, and as an imposition, it could be arbitrary, like why is this border here or not, right? It's political, there's a negotiation, but also the sense of nationality as an affinity, and also in connection with something wider, right? That transnational community. So using the newspapers to subvert and expand then on that notion, I think it's again something very fascinating there. Also talking about that sense of the utopias or the aspirational, right? That what Capetillo was presenting is, I'm working with the realities of my time, but this is also a blueprint that you can update according to circumstances. So here you have, this is what I can give you now. This is not the final point, like the final period, like this is the end of it, but you can elaborate on this. So there's this aspirational of thinking of possibilities, of having something that can be updated and adapted, right, to ever-changing circumstances. I also liked how you, you centered your talk also about, this Capetillo also being atemporal in the sense that, the time traveler, that she's very relevant today, that we keep re-signifying her, because when Julio Ramos was putting together, and he was doing this call for different essays for his his re-edition of Amor y Anarquía, I was thinking of how Capetillo, I mean, for those of us, not everybody here might know, or the specificities of El Verano del 19 in Puerto Rico, and that highly political, that people came together to oust a governor. That to me was unimaginable before, because, there's a lot of partisanship. But the fact that people made the difference between, I don't care if I am pro this or pro that. As a Puerto Rican, we cannot tolerate someone saying, like nefarious thing about the people who died during Hurricane Maria. Like there is a point, there is a limit right here that we are not going to tolerate as Puerto Ricans, even if there's these other differences. So that people came together, that community with, again, people that may be in other debates and tensions otherwise, that coming together, I could envision totally the presence of Capetillo almost, right? Or even thinking of, if we were, let's say that our generations, if we were exposed to like Capetillo's works earlier in our schooling, would this process be different? Or, because in many ways it's like now with, all these editions, and you had, like the Penguin Classics, and now it's available to a wider audience beyond Puerto Rico and everything. But there was a huge gap. She dies in 1922. Norma Valle does that recovery project. We were, excluded from having access to this fascinating figure, which is core to our history. So thank you so much for adding that, that is true, that it's important to contextualize her. And at the same time, also, let's not constrain her just to, that historical juncture of her time. She is as relevant as ever. So any other comments or questions for Jorel?
Absolutely. Can I say one thing just to respond? I think, thank you for those remarks, and for thinking out loud with me on this. And I think, there are many things that you said that I wrote down like 3 pages while you were talking of things like the blueprint that can be updated, the importance of context, and also I think something that you were talking with Stephanie earlier today is this notion of contradiction, the importance of contradiction as well, and recognizing Capetillo as a human with all her complexities and contradictions, right? Because, it's really interesting, this conversation about internationalism. Anarchists were, internationalists, and Capetillo, I used to think that she was also an internationalist, but I found a debate that she had with Cuban anarchists in which she was articulating a defense of the nation, basically. There was a case in which there was a member of the IWW that was killed in Los Angeles, and the Cuban anarchists were condemning the attack, and Capetillo was saying, well, why was he in Los Angeles? Why wasn't he in his country of origin? And so they replied, weren't you an internationalist, right? And so here we see Capetillo articulating what we could see as a problematic sort of discourse if we tend to think of anarchism as a fixed and static sort of ideology. And also, she had problematic things to say about homosexuality, right? And so she is an advocate for free love, but at the same time, she had certain heteronormative notions of the role of women in the household and childbearing and the role of women there. But that doesn't exclude the fact that she is simply amazing, and that she's writing at a moment in which women were not supposed to be writing, women from working class backgrounds. And she's not only writing, she is, putting all of these things to practice. And I think that one of the amazing things that I'll take from this symposium as well is this notion of, translating Capetillo in community. And I think that thinking Capetillo in community is important as well, right? Because I think that she was writing for multiple communities, and she was writing to build communities, right? And so I just wanted to mention that, and also to think, I don't know where Capetillo would stand in terms of Puerto Rican independence. I'm an independentista. I carry my flag here everywhere I go, and I believe in the self-determination of Puerto Rico. But at the same time, I think that her activism and her radicalism was not attentive to the question of the nation, but it doesn't take away the radicalism of her thought.
Mhm.
And because, as an internationalist, all of these anarchists imagined themselves as part of this global community. And so their goal was to overthrow capitalism. And usually that was articulated through a very heteropatriarchal male gaze perspective and discourse. Capetillo was doing that in a discourse rooted in love and humanity. And as Stephanie was saying this morning, the spiritual life as an important component of it, right? And so I think that still today, when we articulate radical revolutionary discourses, rooting those discourses in love in the spiritual plane, it's still transgressive, right? And so I think that is, for me, super important in terms of, the context of where she was writing allows us to understand some of the problematic things she was doing and also to comprehend her as a fully fleshed human. But at the same time, I think that we should also break away from temporality. And I'll stop here, but I think that one of the reasons why I think of Capetillo as a time traveler is because I think that the conception of time that we have in terms of past, present, future is a Eurocentric construct. And I think that when I think of Capetillo, I think that I'm in active dialogue with her. And so it's a trans-historical dialogue that does not respect the past, the present, and the future. And it's all up, for me, a future-oriented history that I try to do in my own work. And so Capetillo was already doing that 100 years ago.
Yeah, and actually several wonderful points there too, is that it is true. Like, I mean, you cannot read Capetillo and think, I mean, if you go in and try to pin her down as independentista, or if you're gonna find a label, again, this is one of those other things that you cannot necessarily pin her down. But that is also important because in connection to what you were saying, Jorel, is like you're envisioning a nation or a way to be Puerto Rican or Caribbean or to be human. So are you gonna then, continue on the path of the patriarchal, like what is the nation that, Mariana Bracetti and the other women at the time as well, right, from that historical context when we're envisioning. So in many ways, it's like Capetillo was concerned of, let's be human, let's liberate us, right, from those, as you would call, the routine formalisms. And so that as you envision that nation, then is that nation going to be, it's going to continue to be a colonialist one, like what type of republic in that sense? So which connects also to another writer from the time, Emilia Casanova in Cuba. So maybe that's for a future project. So, I mean, already define that label so that it's not about one historical juncture, which is interesting, right? Like no political party or ideology in Puerto Rico has been able to claim her, which is wonderful because, those things can get dated right away. So, and let's see, the other thing I wanted, that I wanted to remark was, oh, I think I lost my train of thought. So that you cannot pin her down and label her. Yeah, I mean, and to label her. And there was something else that I'm sure will come to mind. But if anybody else has any other comments or questions, well.
Can I say something very quickly on that last point of claiming Capetillo? I think there's also a danger in over-claiming Capetillo, because one of the flyers that I showed in the last slide was from the municipality of Arecibo, and their slogan is Todos Somos Luisa. And so there is a political project there of appropriating the image of and sanitizing the radicalism of Luisa when state officials are saying everyone is Luisa. And so I think it's, for me, super interesting because you have some guerrilla sort of theater groups that are performing Capetillo in spaces, working class communities. But then you also had on the other side, alcaldes, mayors. I don't know what party the municipality of Arecibo is going for, but PNP or Popular, they're the same. And so they're claiming Capetillo as a slogan. And so there's also a danger in sanitizing Capetillo.
Yeah, that's a very ironic appropriation if you don't even, if you need to really be engaged with Capetillo and understand those intricate. I mean, it's like, no, don't appropriate Capetillo. Yeah, no, but I remember the other point is about, I think, and this has been throughout the whole symposium today, the importance of recognizing the contradictions, because of course it humanizes her. It also shows us the idea she was grappling with, also the fact that since even within the groups that she would belong to, she was also met with suspicion, right, because of gender and other prejudices. Like maybe she wasn't able, I mean, to have these open conversations to actually distill some of the ideas. And I remember several years ago when Stephanie came to one of my classes, one of my seminars, and we were discussing Capetillo. We briefly talked about, that contradiction about how Capetillo presents then the topic of homosexuality, which is, it's problematic, right? Then again, thinking about, we recognize that, but with the levels of the textuality and how she's incorporating different, it's like the texts are very mediated, as Amy and I found out, especially with the first two essays. Is this her voice? Is she trying to exaggerate that heteronormativeness to show its problems? Like, what are the strategies that we need? Do we take it face value or not? And also the fact that in her revision, in the 1913 revision of Mi Opinión, we see that she has thought through more about that, and the tone is completely different and doesn't come across necessarily as homophobic. So we see that there's also a process of revisiting ideas. Again, this is a blueprint, it's a project, and I was wrong in the way I said that, or that wasn't like a very inclusive way. Also have that sense of humility, right? And go back and continue on revising those ideas. So we also see a trajectory there. So yes, I mean, there is that revision of Mi Opinión in a couple of years later in 1913. And I mean, working with contradictions is also a good way to avoid those problematic appropriations, right? So the contradictions of Capetillo, that could still be yet another symposium for us to read together, comment together, perhaps doing other, like trying to interpret, like if we read them out loud and somebody interprets them, is that it could go into so many routes that I think there's still, I gathered today that we're still sort of like scratching the surface, maybe not just the surface, but that there's so much more to undig here with Capetillo. So
hey, Nancy, I would just direct you real quick to the chat to see if there's anything that would like to be addressed in the chat.
Okay, let me check this. All right.
So for example, starting here at Jeffrey Stein writes, Capetillo may not have been arguing against internationalism, but questioning why revolutionaries leave their home countries instead of staying where they can be most effective.
Yeah, so could I add that briefly? So yeah, absolutely. So that's, for me, it was a very interesting debate to find. Basically, it boiled down to Capetillo defending the American Federation of Labor stance. And we were talking earlier about Samuel Gompers. And so she was very involved in the Free Federation of Workers in Puerto Rico, which after 1902 became a satellite of the American Federation of Labor. And so what I felt was happening in that sort of debate is that Capetillo was defending the stance of the AFL, which, as we know, historically was not the most radical. Actually, they cracked down on anarchists, they cracked down on communists. And so in this case is this famous case of this IWW worker that was killed. And so the anarchists in Cuba were basically defending the agenda of the IWW, saying that regardless of the nationality of the worker, he did not belong to a nation. Workers don't have a nation. Right? It's this notion that workers are citizens of the world. And so Capetillo instead was articulating this notion of basically, if I might be misphrasing, but to paraphrase what she was saying, it's like basically saying that he was a coward. She doesn't use these exact words, for leaving his country and try to reap the benefits of another country and what workers there were producing, right? And so it's this idea of workers are coming here stealing our jobs, the 1912 edition. And so it's very problematic, but I also framed it and I read it as part of her defense of the American Federation of Labor stance on labor migration, vis-a-vis the IWW, which was more radical. And so it was full of contradictions. Again, this was 1912, as Nancy was saying. She went back to her ideas, and I think, thank you for bringing, Nancy, this second edition of Mi Opinión, because it's also important that she revised it living in Florida, if I'm remembering correctly. And so that meant that she was engaging in broader intellectual communities. Also, when Capetillo wrote this on internationalism, Capetillo was pissed at the labor movement writ large. There are a series of articles that she publishes in the Cuban press, basically saying that no one is appreciating the work that she does, that she is working until late hours, that she's writing all these things, she's doing all these talks and speeches and discourses, and no one is paying her, and then no one appreciates her. Instead, they're talking trash about her because of her stance on free love. And so she's writing this at a moment where she is really hurt, and she actually says in the page, "I'm hurt, deeply hurt." And so I think it's part of that. I think here context is important. 1912, where she's arriving in Cuba after spending some time in Florida, she's going through this, and so also it speaks about the humanity of Capetillo. Not only, oftentimes we tend to want these people to have certain ideas, but the reality is that they were human and they were constantly changing. And so for me, it was understanding Capetillo as an internationalist, and then finding her articulating this posture or this idea against internationalism was very shocking. But it doesn't take away the fact that she was a badass internationalist organizer.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so there is a comment here by Montse Feo. It says, well, it's a resistant nationalism wants a nation Capetillo, and they would then criticize it. So so it sounds like it has to do with a nationalism based off resistance. There would still be the sense of that they might not be open to that sort of like a new way of envisioning that nation, right? There will always be the detractors. And also it says here, contradiction speaks to the context she was contesting and how hard these contexts are to dismantle. And, we can think of 2022 and how these structures are still hard to dismantle.
Yeah, sorry, I also want to add really quickly that sometimes we forget that the precarious situation of these intellectuals, right? So contradictions must be the very, very few things that we can find, because they were writing and producing ideas in a rush, traveling, trying to preserve their archives. So it's obvious we're going to find all these contradictions and difficulties in their writing because they lack the time and the resources to sometimes think about them, right? There was a sense of urgency. So obviously, if we look at our writing when it's not edited, there will be lots of contradictions there. So sometimes we not only the context of oppression, but as a working class, they didn't have, editors, they didn't have time to revise because always was this urgency. And about the independence and nationalism, I think sometimes it gets complicated, the notion of independence and nationalism with anarchists and other people that are not from the right. And it's, as I said, a mechanism of defense of oppression, right? To find your own ways to construct whatever it is, a nation or whatever other construction. But once it's constructed, obviously, we're going to start criticizing it again, right? So it's not saying that we accept it like the best, but it's something that prevents from oppressions from other nations.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And we have another comment here. This is from Michelle Haberlin, who's one of our graduate students, first-year graduate students. She says, I would be very interested to read more about Capetillo's view, both previous and then revised, regarding gender norms of the time, as well as how the concept of free love then applies to potential applications onto homosexuality and genderqueer identity. So this would also be like one of those areas that, you know, there have been approaches to it, but a more dedicated study would definitely be important and relevant. So yes, and thank you for your interest in reading more about Capetillo. This is what we wanted to do with the symposium.
Can I say something real
Of
quick?
course,
To
yes.
reply to Monse, first, Monse, hola. I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to say that when I was a MA student starting my first year of my master's, Monse was one of the scholars in this anarchist studies community that really helped me and believed in my work and treated me as an equal and as a colleague. And so I'm so appreciative of Monse, and I owe so much to her. And so just, I want to say thank you. And so to your comment, yes, I think the urgency is so important. And I think it was Alex that was mentioning this in terms of translation and, you know, how do we think about those words that are misspelled? Because it's important. I think, you know, I was thinking about those, when you misspell words in that sort of moment, it's quite telling about how these texts were written, right? And so, and so I just wanted to echo and say that, yes, that we need to take into consideration the urgency and the positionality of those that are writing. And in terms of nationalism, it makes me think of, you know, although in Puerto Rico, we didn't have the sort of revolutionary war that Cuba had in 1895, but anarchists around the world were debating, should we back the Cuban nationalists? Like, what is going to be our stance in relation to? And so this was a debate that was happening on a global scale, right? And so I think that Capetillo is also part of that. And in Puerto Rico, we don't have a strong independentista movement in the early 20th century. And it was mostly part of the intellectual elite that were independentistas. There was not a working class, broad working class independentista movement. And so that is one thing. The other is that the United States was seen as the beacon of liberty. And so we have working class socialist texts that were published in Puerto Rico in 1903, in 1904, in 1905, in which they're advocating for revolution, yet the first page has a quote from George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, right? And they didn't see a contradiction there, because for them, it was, you know, the United States is the beacon of liberty and freedom. And the American Federation of Labor was crucial in articulating that discourse within the working classes. And I think that Capetillo was an emissary in that process. She had the heart in the right place, but it was part of a broader colonial project that the American Federation was doing in Puerto Rico. So also, again, the contradictions of Capetillo.
Okay. Thank you so much for this yet another wonderful keynote. I'm going to share my screen briefly so we can wrap up. It felt like it went so fast, which is that's a good thing. So that means that we were really engaged with it. So so Amy has been putting some information in the chat. So I know that we're leaving today with lots of ideas, hopefully new projects, hopefully potential symposia in the future and collaborations. I want to highly stress the importance of, you know, dialogue and communication and collaboration, since, you know, usually we're so busy in academia and we tend to be siloed that there is a lot to be gained by working also in collaboration, and that Luisa Capetillo is pretty much telling us, please do this, please. It's a way to honor her birthday. And also that if you still have questions or ideas, you want to keep in touch, our email addresses. So for me, it's birdsoto@uwm.edu. And for Amy, it is Amy T. Olin at uwm.edu. And I think that one of the images here that we can wrap up with is what Jarell was talking about, the impressive mental library of Luisa Capetillo and how we can keep accessing aspects of that mental library. It's like we're going into this library of hers in her mind and just exploring her just the brilliance of that mind and that project, that aspirational project that she calls us to keep thinking about and implementing. So any other remarks, Amy?
No, just thank you so much to everybody who came and celebrated this Capetillo's birthday with us. And thank you for the wonderful keynotes, the student panel, and thank you, Nancy, for all the work you've done to organize this. And of course, thank you to Julie for all your help in organizing this panel as well.
Thank you so much y a seguir capetillando. Cuídense.
Thank you.